Welcome back to Proxhammer, everybody. And today we're going to be doing a video on why Dark Reapers deserve a rework. So, as many of you know, Dark Reapers are not the strongest unit in the Eldar Codex, but it kind of goes beyond that. They're actually one of the weakest units in the Codex. Pretty much unusable outside of, well, unusable definitely in competitive play as far as their effectiveness. And also pretty hard to use in casual and even semi-competitive play as well. So I've used Dark Reapers in a number of my games in this new edition, and they are far and above worse than they were last edition. And this is saying a lot because basically every unit in our codex got a buff of some kind. And even if they still aren't optimal, they at least got buffed in some way. For example, Storm Guardians. Still not the best unit, obviously, but they did get a buff, unlike Dark Reapers, which basically just got a slew of nerfs, and in my opinion, are pretty hard to use now, and pretty hard to say that they're actually able to become a good unit. And not only by Eldar standards, but by other faction standards, Dark Reapers as the heavy option for infantry, they just don't cut it. Right? They're pretty much worse than any other unit in any other codex in the heavy support category. So what we're going to be doing in this video is we're going to be looking at what we can do to hypothetically make Dark Reapers better, but obviously not overpowered. So let's get right into it. So what we're going to be doing in this video is basically taking a look at their current stats, weapons, and special rules, just as a kind of a brief overview to refresh your guys' minds on the rules that Dark Reapers have. Then we're going to look at where Dark Reapers are competitively, semi-competitively, and casually. And lastly, we're going to be looking at what can be done to improve Dark Reapers in a way that doesn't make them super overpowered and broken, but actually usable. Looking at the Dark Reaper stat line first, we can see that, honestly, it doesn't look that bad, right? Except when you notice that they are slower than average Eldar units, and that they're 30 points a model. So for that 30 points, you would expect that they have a lot of cool special rules and they have a lot of damage, right? Especially since their movement is slower than Eldar, you'd expect them to have more firepower than your average aspect warrior. But unfortunately, when you look at their base weapon, it is actually not that effective. It does have great range, strength, and damage with a variable firing mode, which is awesome. But the problem with it is that the AP value is almost non-existent, especially against Armor of Contempt and Void Armor enemies. These guys are just not going to be doing a lot of damage in the way of wounds, especially since the Star Swarm, basically firing mode, only has 2 shots. Which is a big issue, because if you have a low AP weapon, typically you would expect a higher number of shots, which Dark Reapers just do not have. Or you would expect that weapon to have the blast special rule or something like that. But unfortunately, it doesn't. It doesn't have blast. It doesn't have a lot of shots. And it's low AP. So it's supposed to be good at killing high armor infantry. And it just doesn't, right? I remember playing Dark Reapers back in the day and just absolutely shredding heavy infantry like Marines like nothing. Now, they're basically lucky if they can kill a couple of Marines a turn, which is really unfortunate because not only do you pay a high cost for them, but they're super cool and they just don't do a lot of damage. As for the Exarch, hopefully, fingers crossed, you would think that because the Dark Reaper weapon isn't that great, the Exarch would make up for it. So the Exarch has a couple of options. The Shuriken Cannon is an old classic, doesn't really do a lot of damage, and it's pretty much short range. So it's not really that effective with the Dark Reaper unit because most of their weapons are range 24. The Tempest Launcher is a little bit better at range, 36 range, which should be good enough to target most units with the Dark Reapers. It's heavy 2d6, strength 4, AP -2, and damage 1 with the blast keyword. So this is obviously something that is meant for dealing with infantry, lighter infantry because of the AP, but also it's able to target infantry that's out of line of sight. So pretty decent weapon overall, and possibly one of my favorites in the current Dark Reaper setup. And lastly, the Dark Reaper Exarch can take an Eldari missile launcher, which is just a slightly better version of the Reaper launcher, and grants access to the Starhawk missile stratagem to be used against flyers. So again, it's slightly better, it's slightly more points, probably, I wouldn't say it's completely worth it, but I would say it's definitely worth a shot if you're thinking of going with the regular Reaper launcher. As for the special rules, they have a 5+ invulnerable save like all aspect warriors, and they have this ability called inescapable accuracy, which basically ignores dense cover when making attacks. Now, I have a big complaint about this, and the reason why I complain about this is because a lot of the terrain that you will find on most boards is actually light cover. You won't find much dense cover on boards, and this is really not going to come into play all that often. Not only that, but this special rule is basically a extreme nerf to the previous iteration of the rule in the last codex, which basically had Dark Reapers always hitting on 3s. Now, while I understand GW's reasoning on taking that away because it was non-interactive, for example, if a unit had something that gave them a -1 to hit, Dark Reapers would just ignore it, which could seem kind of unfair to a lot of people. But at the very least, give Dark Reapers a +1 to hit. Or something like that. Some sort of permanent modifier and not something that is just based off of a unit being in dense cover. So unfortunately, the ability is not that great and really doesn't come into play all that often. As for the Exarch powers, they are some of the most lackluster Exarch powers in the entire book. If we look at Reaper's Reach, basically the unit can move and fire heavy weapons without penalty. This is something that is nice, but again, because Dark Reapers have a slower movement and are very fragile, typically Dark Reapers are just going to be staying as far back as possible. So being able to move around is nice, but it could also affect firing lanes and things like that. So you really don't want to move them all that much, and Reaper's Reach really isn't going to be able to do much for them. And again, having -1 to hit, hitting on 3 or hitting on 4s versus 3s, it does affect their accuracy, it does affect their damage, but not by a significant amount to really matter. Focused Fire is basically an ability that gives the Dark Reaper Exarch a +1 to the attack's wound roll, and it's really only good, in my opinion, with the Tempest Launcher, as the other weapons don't have enough attacks to make it worth the points. So essentially what that means is that if you're using an Eldar missile launcher or something like that, instead of wounding on 4s or wounding on 3s, you would wound on 3s or 2s, which is nice, but again, for the points that you pay for it, it's not really that great. And lastly, we have Bringer of Death. So this is one of the more, in my opinion, lackluster abilities. It has a lot of text, but honestly not a lot of power. It gives you 1 additional attack on the Reaper Launcher and Shuriken Cannon, which is nearly worthless for the high price you pay for the ability. And if you have a Tempest Launcher or an Eldari Missile Launcher, you ignore light cover with the attack, which is, again, it's nice, but it's not that great because only the Exarch benefits. And in addition to this, we have plenty of ways to include reveal and things that would ignore cover in our lists anyway. So a common inclusion in most competitive Eldar lists is a Warlock with the reveal psychic power. And basically that means that we can ignore light cover anyway if we get that successfully off. So not the best ability, to be honest with you. It's nice. It's probably better than some of the other options, but again, there's ways to get around this already. And the other funny thing also is that essentially this includes all cover, right? It says ignores the benefits of cover against that attack, right? Does not receive the benefits of cover. So that means light cover and dense cover in most cases. Well, Dark Reapers already ignore dense cover, so having this is kind of a little bit redundant. So where does that land Dark Reapers competitively, semi-competitively, and casually? And although I do think Dark Reapers are a really cool unit, they are very, well, honestly meh in semi-competitive and casual play as well, because they really don't have a role that other units don't perform better with less effort, less points spent, and honestly, less slots used, right? Heavy support slot is a very contested category, and Dark Reapers, being as bad as they are just not in a position to compete for it. And in competitive play, in the higher levels of competitive play, you know, for those people playing in tournaments and things like that, in match play and in the Nephilim expansion, they are essentially a complete joke. Ranking among one of the worst units in the Codex, arguably the worst, at the same level, honestly, if not lower than Storm Guardians. And I say that with all due respect. I love Dark Reapers, but to be honest with you guys, if you're not playing a game for fun or including them in your list for a fluffy reason, there's really just no reason to take them, because not only do they take up a heavy support slot, but they just don't do a lot of damage, and they're going to be a handicap on your army. It's kind of like having 75 points less than your opponent, realistically. And the thing about Storm Guardians is at least Storm Guardians have objective secure. They can go after objectives and perform actions without really sacrificing a whole lot. They're very cheap. Dark Reapers are very expensive and do very little damage. So unfortunately, in competitive play, Dark Reapers just aren't really that great. They're a really cool unit. They're just not good. And that honestly has a lot to do with the way GW wrote the rules for these guys. So the real question is, what can be done to improve Dark Reapers? So I guess this is my appeal to GW for what it's worth, to maybe, who knows, maybe a developer will look at this video and think, maybe there's some room to make a few changes to make this unit more marketable. Because at the end of the day, all of us know that GW cares about money first and foremost. Like all corporations, it wants to make a profit. And especially since they put a lot of money and work into making the new Dark Reaper kit, you would think they would want to make them better so that more players would buy them, right? So what I'm going to propose is a number of changes can basically be made to increase their viability by tweaking their rules and weapons slightly while staying true to the strength of the unit, and at the same time, make them much more appealing and much more playable without them becoming super OP. We don't want another Leagues of Votann fiasco now, do we? I couldn't resist, I'm sorry. So, looking first at their special rule is inescapable accuracy. So, the original rule says each time a model in this unit makes a range attack, the target does not receive the benefits of dense cover against that attack. Now, what I would propose is a change to, instead of just dense cover, period, right? So that means light cover and dense cover. So what this is going to do is it's essentially going to allow them to also ignore light cover when making attacks instead of just dense cover. So this will allow the unit to get a lot more use out of its ability. Instead of just proccing every once in a while, you're basically going to be using this ability every single turn to ignore one or the other aspects of cover. The next proposed change I would make is changing the Reaper Launcher's AP, just giving them an additional -1. So basically the Star Shot and Star Swarm would have -3 AP instead of just -2. So one of Dark Reaper's biggest issues as of now is that they just can't get through armor, especially with Armor of Contempt and Void Armor and things like that. Dark Reapers just don't stand a chance in that department. So by basically giving them -1 AP and combining that with the ability to also ignore light cover, these guys can actually deal good damage against mech-style enemies. Who would have thought that a unit of Dark Reapers who are designed to kill mechs can actually kill mechs? Right? They weren't able to do this before, and honestly, they'd be lucky to kill a couple of Marines a turn with the current rules. So this, combined with the inescapable accuracy change, would help them big time against heavily armored targets like Space Marines and Primaris Marines and things like that. So on to the Exarch powers. So with Bringer of Death, my proposed change is that instead of making one additional attack with either the Reaper Launcher or the Shuriken Cannon, the Exarch would actually double that weapon's attacks. So essentially the Reaper Launcher, if it chooses to shoot its Star Shot, would shoot 2 attacks just like normal. And if it shot its Star Swarm, on the other hand, it would shoot 4. If, for whatever reason, you choose to go with a Shuriken Cannon, instead of shooting 3 shots, you would shoot 6 shots. Actually might be a reason to take the Shuriken Cannon in some cases. So this makes this much better and makes this ability actually usable on things other than the Tempest Launcher. And speaking of, if the Exarch has an Eldari Missile Launcher or Tempest Launcher, each time that unit makes a range attack, instead of just ignoring the benefits of cover, add +1 to the wound roll and improve that attack's armor penetration characteristic by 1. So basically, this would make both the Eldari missile launcher and the Tempest launcher much better at killing their proposed targets, which are infantry, and in the case of the Eldari missile launcher, a little bit better at cracking through harder targets. So I believe that these changes, while powerful, are not OP because, again, it only affects the X-Arc, so only the X-Arc is getting the +1 to wound and the -1 additional AP. And again, the X-Arc is only getting double the weapon's attack. So I think that in both of these cases, these buffs are pretty significant, but they're not OP. The next proposed change I would make is to Focus Fire. So currently Focus Fire adds 1 to the attack's wound roll, which, while not bad on the X-Arc, it's just not that unique and doesn't really add much to the unit. So my proposed change for this is, instead of adding 1 to the attack's wound roll, it would allow you to ignore the Lookout Sir rule. So this would actually allow the X-Arc to do something a little bit special and give you some utility in being able to target enemy characters. So this could be really useful for tagging characters that are a little bit weaker, things like commissars, things like apothecaries, or characters like that in that same kind of realm. So basically what this would do is this would allow your unit of Dark Reapers to target supporting characters that Rangers might not be able to take out alone. Your Dark Reaper X-Arc could take them out and thus shut down some of their more powerful aura type abilities. And lastly, we have the Reaper's Reach X-Arc power. So this basically allows the unit to move and shoot without the hit roll penalty for firing heavy weapons on the move. What I would propose is to change this ability to this unit gains the battle focus ability. So one of the major drawbacks of Dark Reapers is that they are not mobile and they do not do well out of a transport. So to be honest with you, a lot of the times, Dark Reapers just cannot keep up with other Eldar units in that they can shoot, but after they shoot, they are always going to be vulnerable to counterattack. And because they are Eldar units, they're extremely fragile and they don't have anything in the way of survivability. So having the battle focus ability would allow the unit to basically stay in the backfield, take pot shots where it can, and then hide behind terrain out of line of sight. This would also offset their very slow movement of 6. And it's funny because regular armies like, Space Marine Devastators and stuff like that are movement 6. So it's kind of funny to think of an Eldar unit being just as slow as a Space Marine or Imperial Guard unit, unfortunately. However, with this battle focus ability, they would actually be able to do what Eldar do best, which is hit the enemy and then not be able to be hit back. So in conclusion, unfortunately, Dark Reapers got handed a number of nerfs when the new 9th edition Codex came out, and in addition, they got some very meh X-Arc powers to boot. And this has just put Dark Reapers in a really poor spot compared to almost every other damage dealing unit in the Codex, which really sucks because Dark Reapers are probably one of the coolest units in the book. I mean, who doesn't like skulls, right? And not to mention those weapons, which look like spears. Yeah, spears. And I think that with some minor changes, Dark Reapers can really be a fantastic unit again without being OP or broken. So again, none of the rules that I mentioned and none of the changes that I mentioned are really that much of a stretch. They're not really changing the way the unit works. They're just making them a little bit more effective at what they already do best. And my hope for this video is that, again, maybe if Isha is watching, maybe a developer can come along at some point, watch this video, and make the necessary changes on GW's behalf to Dark Reapers to make them more effective. Because honestly, I think it's a great codex overall. I just think there's a couple of tweaks and changes that need to be made here and there to a couple of units to bring them in line with the awesomeness that is the rest of the codex. All right, everybody, that's going to be it for today. Please do leave a comment in the comment section if you have any advice about how to make Dark Reapers better. Maybe if we comment enough, we can attract the attention of some sort of Games Workshop employee or developer who can pass this info along, and hopefully they can start to get to work on some of these changes. Maybe. My hopes aren't high, but who knows, right? Anything could happen. All right, everybody. Until next time, peace out. See you guys later.